Eleanor Nora Whitfield sat near the window of the westbound train, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels echoed like a heartbeat that wasn't her own, steady, relentless, and pulling her farther away from everything she'd ever known. She didn't cry. She'd already spent too many nights doing that. Her tears had never stopped her father from signing the letter that promised her as a mail-order bride to a rancher in Wyoming territory. A bargain sealed with ink and desperation. Outside, endless plains stretched under a pale sky, dotted with patches of snow and the distant silhouettes of wild horses. Nora had never seen so much land in her life. In Boston, everything had been narrow, streets, houses, even people's hearts. Out here, the world felt terrifyingly open, as if she could fall into it and vanish without a trace. She pressed her fingers to the window, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure she believed anymore. She'd been raised to be obedient, to do what was expected of a proper young lady. But nothing about this journey felt proper. Her father had told her she was being saved, that a respectable marriage to a rancher would clear their debts and restore their name. Yet Nora knew the truth. She was being traded, sold off like a possession, a bride by paper and postage. As the train slowed at the dusty town of Willow Creek, her stomach knotted tighter. She pictured a gruff man with a hard face, maybe one who'd demand silence and obedience. She'd heard stories from other brides, men who drank too much, who saw their wives as hired help rather than partners. She was ready for that, expecting it. She told herself not to flinch when it came. When the doors opened, the dry wind hit her full in the face, carrying the scent of earth and horses. She stepped down, clutching her small carpet bag, and looked around for the man who now owned her future. There were a few cowboys loitering by the post office, a group of women whispering outside the mercantile, and a wagon waiting by the hitching post. Then she saw him. He wasn't what she imagined. Caleb Harland was tall, broad-shouldered, and sun-browned from years of ranch work, but his eyes, steady gray and calm, held no sharpness. He took off his hat as he approached her, his movements measured and gentle, as though he were afraid of startling her. "Mrs. Whitfield?" he asked softly. She nodded, her voice caught somewhere between fear and formality. "Yes, sir, Nora Whitfield." He gave a faint smile. "Name's Caleb Harland. You must be tired. Long trip." She hesitated, unsure what to say. No man had ever spoken to her like that. No command, no cold appraisal. Just simple courtesy. He reached for her bag, but instead of taking it from her hand, he waited. It took her a moment to realize he was asking permission. "I can manage," she murmured, clutching it closer. He nodded once. "All right then, my wagon's this way. Let's get you home before the rain catches us." Home. The word struck something deep inside her chest. She followed him in silence, her boots crunching on the dirt road. The people in town stared. She felt their curiosity burn against her back, but Caleb didn't seem to notice or care. He helped her up into the wagon, adjusted the blanket on the seat beside her, and clicked the reins gently. The horses started forward, and the town faded behind them. Nora sat stiffly, the wind tugging at her bonnet strings. She waited for him to speak harshly, to remind her why she was there. But Caleb only glanced at her once and said quietly, "You look tired, ma'am. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. No demand, no claim, only kindness." For the first time since she'd left home, Nora wasn't sure what to fear anymore. The wagon creaked along the winding dirt road until the town disappeared behind them, swallowed by the endless stretch of prairie. For miles, there was nothing but the hum of wind through the grass and the soft jingle of the harness. Nora sat stiffly, hands folded tight, every bump in the road reminding her of how far from Boston she had come and how utterly alone she was. When they finally reached the Harland Ranch, dusk was already spilling over the fields. The sight took her breath for a moment, not because it was grand, but because it was quietly beautiful. The whitewashed farmhouse stood at the edge of golden pasture land, its porch sagging slightly but clean, its windows lit by the glow of lanterns. A barn stood beyond it, sturdy and still, with a single horse watching their arrival from the corral. Everything seemed cared for yet empty, as if life had once filled these spaces and then slipped away. Caleb halted the wagon beside the porch. "Welcome home," he said simply, though the word home caught awkwardly in his throat, as if he wasn't used to saying it aloud. Nora stepped down, her boots landing softly on the dry earth. The air smelled faintly of hay and pine, and though it should have felt like safety, she couldn't shake the unease curling through her stomach. The house loomed ahead, beautiful, yes, but heavy with silence. Caleb led her up the steps and opened the front door. "You can set your bag in the front room," he said, standing aside to let her in first. She crossed the threshold hesitantly, her eyes adjusting to the dim glow of oil lamps. The interior was tidy but sparse, wooden floors, a few worn rugs, and a stone fireplace still faintly warm from an earlier fire. Yet there was something else in the air, a hush, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She noticed it in the little things. A woman's shawl folded neatly on the back of a chair, a pair of children's books stacked on a shelf, a faint trace of lavender that didn't belong to her. Ghosts of a life once lived here. Caleb caught her looking and cleared his throat. "My wife Mary passed 3 winters ago." His voice was even, but his eyes flickered toward the empty rocking chair by the hearth. "Haven't changed much in here since." Nora's fingers tightened around the handle of her carpet bag. She didn't know what to say. No words seemed right. She had come here expecting cruelty or control, not grief. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He nodded once, a small, tired smile ghosting across his face. "Wasn't your doing. Just time's way of taking what it will." Then in the same quiet tone he added, "You'll have your own room at the back of the house. There's warm water in the basin if you want to wash up. I'll tend to the horses." He turned to leave. But Nora spoke quickly. "I can help with supper. Mr. Harland, it's the least I can do." He stopped at the door, glancing back at her with a faint crease in his brow. "You don't have to. You've traveled enough for one day. Rest. Rest." No man had ever told her to rest before. She didn't know how to accept that. Still she nodded, watching him disappear into the fading light. Later, as she sat on the edge of the bed in the small guest room, the quiet pressed around her like a blanket too heavy to move. She could hear the faint rustle of the wind outside and Caleb's footsteps in the yard. Her fear hadn't vanished, but it had changed. It wasn't fear of harm anymore. It was fear of not knowing how to live in a place where kindness didn't demand a cost. And as the night deepened, Nora whispered to the darkness, "I don't understand him." But a tiny part of her heart, buried deep in trembling, hoped that someday she would. Morning came soft and gray over the Harlan ranch. The rooster's cry startled Nora from uneasy sleep, and for a long moment she forgot where she was. The small room was unfamiliar, simple wooden walls, sunlight slipping through thin curtains, and the faint creak of the house breathing around her. Then memory settled in, the train, the rancher, the quiet house filled with ghosts. She dressed quickly, tying her hair back with a ribbon and stepping into the hall. The smell of coffee and baking bread drifted from the kitchen. To her surprise, it wasn't Caleb who was there, but a woman, elderly, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and sleeves rolled to her elbows. "You must be Miss Whitfield," the woman said with a warm smile. "I'm Mrs. Turner. I come by now and then to help with chores. Caleb said you'd be needing breakfast after that long journey." Nora nodded awkwardly. He's very kind," she said, unsure what else to say. Mrs. Turner's smile softened. "Kind, yes. Quiet, too quiet sometimes. That man's had more loss than most his age. But he's good to the bone." Nora looked down at her hands. "He doesn't seem like most men." "No," the older woman said, turning a loaf of bread from the oven. "He isn't." When Caleb entered, brushing dust from his coat, he greeted her with a polite nod, not a single assumption or expectation in his manner. "Morning, Nora. Hope you slept well. There's no rush on anything today. Just get used to the place." It was strange hearing her name like that. Gentle, without demand. Over the next several days, Nora tried to find her footing. She cleaned the house, fed the hens, and helped in the kitchen when Mrs. Turner visited. Caleb worked from dawn until the stars came out, his steady presence comforting in a way she didn't understand. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, yet somehow his silence said more than words could. One afternoon, Nora found herself in the barn, running her hand over the smooth flank of a mare. The animal flinched at her touch and she pulled back quickly. Caleb appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's gentle," he said, stepping closer. "Just needs to know you mean no harm." He guided her hand back to the horse's neck, his touch light but steady. "Like people. Some folks take a while to believe they're safe. The words settled deep in her chest. For a heartbeat, she wanted to tell him everything. The debt, her father's coldness, the feeling of being treated like something worthless. But the habit of silence was strong. Instead, she managed a small, trembling smile. I suppose I'm one of those folks. Caleb looked at her then, really looked. Aren't we all? From that moment, something began to shift between them. Not romance, not yet, but a fragile trust. He showed her how to mend a fence, how to read the clouds for rain, and how to calm a skittish foal. Each lesson carried a gentleness that surprised her. There was never correction, never criticism, only patience. But when the evenings came and she sat by the fire alone, the shadows of her past still whispered. She remembered her father's angry voice, her mother's tears, the sharpness of words meant to remind her of her duty. You're lucky anyone would have you, Eleanor. And though Caleb's kindness wrapped around her like sunlight, she still couldn't let herself believe it would last. One night, she saw him standing outside, staring at the horizon long after dark. She wanted to ask what haunted him, but fear held her tongue. Instead, she whispered to the empty air, maybe we're both ghosts, just trying to feel alive again. Inside that lonely thought, a new truth began to take root. Healing wasn't quick, and freedom didn't come from escape. It came from learning to stay where kindness lived. Winter's chill gave way to the slow thaw of spring, and with it, the land around the Harlan ranch began to soften. Patches of green pushed through the frost, streams whispered again, and the horses grew restless in their pens. So did Nora. Weeks had turned into months since she first stepped onto Caleb Harlan's land, and though the sharp fear that once followed her had dulled, it had not vanished entirely. Every small kindness still caught her off guard, the way Caleb set an extra log on the fire before she woke, or how he left a wildflower in a jar on the table without ever mentioning it. He treated her not as something owed to him, but as someone to be gently seen. Still, Nora found it hard to let herself breathe fully. She kept to her chores, careful and quiet, afraid that one mistake might shatter this strange peace. It was one afternoon in early April when Caleb found her standing at the edge of the corral, watching a young colt buck and snort in protest at the halter he was trying to fit. The animal's eyes were wild, full of mistrust. Nora saw too much of herself in them. She's afraid, Nora said softly. Caleb nodded, the rope loose in his hands. Ain't her fault. Some folks think you can break a horse by force. I don't believe in breaking. I believe in earning trust. The words settled deep inside her. She didn't realize he was teaching her something more than ranch work until much later. He handed her the rope. Here, try. Nora hesitated, shaking her head. She won't let me. Don't think about what she'll let you do, Caleb said gently. Just let her see you ain't gonna hurt her. She took the rope with trembling fingers and stepped slowly toward the colt. Her movements were cautious, her voice soft as she whispered nonsense words into the wind. The colt flinched but didn't bolt. Another step, then another, until the animal's breath warmed her hand. When she finally slipped the halter into place, her heart beat so fast she could hardly breathe. Caleb smiled, just a faint curve of his lips, but it lit something in her chest. See, she trusts you now. Nora looked down at her hands. I didn't think she would. You didn't give her a reason not to, he replied simply. That night, the rain came. It began as a whisper against the roof, then turned fierce, wind howling through the trees, thunder rolling across the valley. Caleb ran out to the barn to check the animals, and Nora followed without thinking, her skirts soaking through almost instantly. Inside, the wind slammed against the walls, rattling the stalls. A lantern flickered on a hook, casting unsteady light over them both. You shouldn't be out here, Caleb said, his voice barely audible over the storm. I can help, she insisted, gripping the edge of a feed bin to steady herself. I'm not afraid. For a long moment their eyes met, hers wide with determination, his filled with something quieter, something she couldn't yet name. Together they worked in silence, calming the horses, tightening the latches, pushing back against the storm. When the worst had passed, they stood in the half-dark, soaked and trembling. Nora's hands shook as she brushed her wet hair from her face. When I came here, she said softly, I thought you'd want obedience. I thought you'd want control. But you never, her voice broke. You never made me afraid. Caleb stepped closer, his tone low and steady. Then I'll spend every day making sure you never are." Tears slipped down her cheeks, mixed with the rain. For the first time in years, she didn't try to hide them. Something changed in that barn. Not a declaration, not a promise, but an understanding. Kindness, she realized, could be strong. It could heal without demand, and for the first time since she'd left home, Nora didn't feel like someone's burden. She felt alive. By late spring, the ranch had settled into a rhythm, a kind of quiet harmony that Nora had never known before. The horses grew fat and glossy, the fields shimmered with green, and the air was thick with the scent of wild sage. Each day began with the soft sound of Caleb's boots on the porch and ended with the low hum of crickets beyond her window. Yet, the peace that filled the ranch didn't reach the town of Willow Creek. When Nora began accompanying Caleb on his supply trips, she could feel the stares even before she stepped down from the wagon. The townsfolk had always been curious about the quiet rancher who rarely smiled and the mysterious woman who'd come from back east to marry him. But curiosity soon turned into whispers. At first they were small things, side glances, half smiles, murmured words that stopped the moment she turned her head. Then came the questions disguised as kindness. "You must be so lonely out there, dear," said Mrs. Doyle, the mercantile owner's wife, her voice syrupy sweet. "No children, no social calls. And I hear Mr. Harlan keeps to himself." Nora forced a polite smile. "He's a good man," she said simply. "Oh, I don't doubt that," Mrs. Doyle replied, her eyes gleaming with gossip. "But people talk, you know. They say he doesn't treat you like a proper wife. Some even say you've got your own room." The words hit like a slap. Nora froze, heat flooding her cheeks. "That's between us," she said quietly. Mrs. Doyle only shrugged, clearly pleased to have struck a nerve. "Of course, dear. I meant no offense, but a husband who won't even share a roof proper. It does make folks wonder what you are to him." That night, back at the ranch, Nora replayed the conversation again and again. "What you are to him." The words echoed in her mind until they bruised. When Caleb noticed her silence at supper, he set down his fork. "Something happened in town?" She hesitated. "They talk about us," she said at last. "About me. They think I'm not your wife in truth." Caleb's brow furrowed slightly. "Does it matter what they think?" "Maybe not to you," she whispered, staring down at her hands. "But to me it feels like I'm doing something wrong. Like I'm not enough." Caleb leaned back in his chair, his voice steady and low. "You owe them nothing, Nora. And you don't owe me anything either. You don't have to prove your worth to anyone." His words were calm, but they burned through the shame in her chest. Still, she couldn't shake the ache. For days afterward, she worked harder than ever, mending fences, tending the garden, baking bread for the hands, trying to silence the whispers in her own head. Yet Caleb saw through her quiet exhaustion. One evening he found her in the garden, dirt streaking her skirt and hair falling loose from its pins. She was on her knees, pulling weeds with trembling hands. "Nora," he said gently, kneeling beside her, "you don't have to do this." She kept her eyes on the soil. "If I work hard enough, maybe they'll stop talking." He shook his head. "You can't earn peace from people who thrive on noise." The simple truth of it broke something inside her. Tears welled up, unbidden. "I just don't want to be a disappointment," she whispered. Caleb reached out, brushing a streak of dirt from her cheek with the back of his hand. "You're not," he said quietly. "You're the only good thing that's come through that gate in years." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not pity, but sincerity. That night, as the lantern light flickered across the walls, Nora finally began to understand. Freedom wasn't just the absence of chains. It was learning not to live for the voices that tried to bind her again. And though the whispers in town would continue, they no longer owned her heart. Summer came with heat that shimmered across the plains and made even the wind feel dry. The grass grew tall and brittle, the earth cracked, and every day the air hung heavy with the faint scent of dust and danger. Caleb had been watchful for weeks. He knew the signs: a season too hot, winds too sharp. "The land's thirsty," he'd said one morning, scanning the horizon. "When the lightning comes, it won't be rain that follows." Nora had nodded, not fully understanding the worry shadowing his tone. But the truth came fast. It began one afternoon as she was hanging linens behind the house. A strange stillness fell, the kind that made the world seem to hold its breath. Then in the distance, a column of dark smoke twisted upward into the sky. "Caleb!" she shouted, dropping the sheet she held. He was already running from the barn, his eyes locked on the rising smoke. "Wildfire," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "It's moving fast." He ran for the horses, calling orders to the ranch hands who'd come sprinting from the fields. "Get the cattle out to the north pasture." "Move quick!" Nora followed him to the barn, her heart pounding. "What can I do?" "You get to safety," he said without looking at her, throwing saddles onto 2 horses. She stepped forward, her voice sharp with resolve. "I can help." He turned then, about to argue, but something in her eyes stopped him. "Stay close," he said finally, "and do what I say." Together they worked side by side, smoke already stinging their throats. The fire was racing down from the ridge, red and angry, snapping through the dry brush. The horses screamed in fear as the air thickened with ash. Caleb's shirt was soaked with sweat and soot when he handed her a rope. "Take them toward the creek bed," he shouted over the roar. "Keep them moving. Don't let them bolt." Nora coughed, eyes burning, but she grabbed the reins and led the terrified horses through the smoke. Every instinct screamed to run, but she kept her voice calm and steady, just as he'd taught her with the colt months ago. When she looked back, she saw Caleb near the barn door, trying to free a trapped calf. A burning beam cracked and fell, striking him to the ground. "Caleb!" Without thinking, she ran back into the smoke. The heat was unbearable. Her lungs burned, her skirt caught sparks, but she didn't stop. She pulled at the beam with all her strength, coughing and crying his name until finally it shifted enough for him to crawl free. "Go!" he rasped, pushing her ahead of him. They stumbled out together, collapsing near the creek as the world behind them blazed. For a long time neither spoke, just the sound of their ragged breathing and the crackling inferno consuming the barn. When the worst had passed, Nora turned to him, eyes wide with tears and soot. "You said I was free," she whispered hoarsely, "but I chose to come back for you." Caleb stared at her, his face streaked with ash, a quiet awe in his gaze. "You saved my life," she shook her head. "No, you saved mine the day I stepped off that train." He reached for her hand, rough fingers curling around hers, grounding her against the trembling earth. For a moment there was no fire, no fear, just the fierce, fragile pulse of 2 souls who had finally learned what it meant to stand side by side. When dawn broke the next morning, the fire was out, but the barn was gone. Smoke still drifted over the blackened ground. And yet, amidst the ashes, something new had taken root, something unspoken but unbreakable. Caleb turned to her, his voice quiet. "You don't have to stay here now, Nora. You've more than kept your word." She met his eyes, the corners of her mouth trembling in a tired, soot-smudged smile. "I'm not staying because I have to, Caleb," she said. "I'm staying because this is home." The wildfire left the Harland ranch scarred but alive. Blackened fences and smoldering earth stretched across the fields, yet somehow the house still stood, the horses still breathed, and the people who mattered had survived. When the first rain came days later, it felt like a blessing poured straight from heaven. Nora and Caleb worked side by side in the aftermath, rebuilding fences, tending to injured animals, and clearing what the fire had left behind. It was exhausting work, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of quiet understanding. Each evening, when the sun sank behind the hills, Caleb would light a small fire outside and they'd sit together, watching the embers flicker in the dusk. Sometimes he'd tell her stories about the land, how his father had built the barn with his own hands, how Mary, his late wife, had loved the sound of the wind in the pines. He spoke of her not with grief, but with gratitude. And Nora listened, her heart swelling with something gentle and bittersweet. One evening, as they sat near the remains of the barn, she said softly, "You loved her deeply." Caleb nodded, his gaze steady on the horizon. "I did, and for a long time I thought that meant there wasn't any room left in me for anything else." He turned to her then, his voice low. "But maybe love isn't something that runs out. Maybe it just changes shape." The words lingered in the air, trembling like something fragile. Nora looked down at her hands. "I don't know what love is supposed to feel like," she admitted. "I only know that when I'm here I don't feel small anymore. I don't feel like someone's mistake." Caleb reached for her hand, his calloused fingers brushing hers. "Then maybe that's what it feels like." For a long moment, neither moved. The sound of rain dripped from the roof, soft and steady, and the scent of wet earth filled the air. Nora's heart pounded. She had imagined this moment before, what it would mean if the walls between them finally fell. But now that it was here, it felt nothing like the foolish dreams she'd once had as a girl. This wasn't about possession or promises written on paper. It was about choice. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. "Caleb," she whispered, "you don't have to say anything." "You gave me back my freedom, and that's more than I ever hoped for." He smiled faintly. "Maybe freedom means getting to choose who you give your heart to." Nora felt her breath catch. He said it so simply, as if love were as natural as breathing. And maybe it was. Slowly, carefully, he cupped her cheek in his hand. The warmth of his touch melted every last bit of fear that had lingered inside her. When he kissed her, it wasn't the rush of passion she'd imagined as a girl. It was quiet, steady, and full of reverence. It felt like home. When he pulled back, his voice was rough. "I don't want a wife bought with a letter, Nora. I want a woman who stays because she wants to." Her smile trembled, her heart full. "Then you already have her." The rain fell harder, but neither of them moved. They sat there in the fading light, hands entwined, hearts finally unguarded. Later, as the fire crackled low, Caleb took her hand once more and said, "We'll build again, better this time, together." And she believed him. Not because he promised it, but because his kindness had never failed her. For the first time, Nora didn't feel like a survivor or a runaway. She felt like a woman who had chosen her life, chosen her love, on her own terms. Spring came late that year, as if the land itself needed time to heal. The charred earth slowly softened, green shoots pushing through where fire had once raged. For the first time since Nora had arrived, the Harland Ranch looked alive again, patched fences mended, the barn rebuilt, the smell of rain and new grass in the air. Every morning, Nora woke before dawn, the sound of roosters echoing from the hills. She would slip quietly out of bed, tie her hair back, and step into the cool morning air. The ranch stretched out before her, endless and wild, yet somehow it no longer felt intimidating. It felt like hers. Inside the new barn, Caleb was already at work, steady, patient, his sleeves rolled up and his hat pushed back. When he saw her, his expression softened into that familiar, quiet smile. "You're up early," he'd tease, though he always knew she would be. "Someone has to make sure you don't work yourself to death," she'd reply, and he'd chuckle. That low, warm sound that always settled deep in her chest. Their rhythm had become something unspoken, a partnership built on mutual respect and quiet affection. He no longer treated her like someone who needed saving, and she no longer looked to him for permission to belong. Together they made decisions about the land, the animals, and the future. When a new foal was born that spring, Caleb handed her the rope and said simply, "She's yours to name." Nora had crouched beside the trembling little creature, stroking its soft mane. "Hope," she whispered. The word felt right, light and unbreakable. At night they sat on the porch beneath a sky scattered with stars. The fields glowed silver in the moonlight, and the sound of crickets filled the quiet. Nora would rest her head on Caleb's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "You ever think about how far you've come?" he asked one evening, his thumb tracing lazy circles on her hand. She smiled. "Every day. I used to think freedom meant running away from everything that hurt. But now I think it's about standing still, and not being afraid anymore." He looked down at her then, eyes warm with pride. "You built that strength yourself, Nora." She shook her head gently. "No, you showed me what kindness could do." I just finally believed it. The months that followed were full of small, beautiful moments. Neighbors who'd once kept their distance now visited often, bringing pies, tools, and laughter. Nora found herself smiling easily, her shyness replaced by quiet confidence. When she helped at church gatherings or mended clothes for families nearby, she no longer felt like a stranger in borrowed shoes. She was home. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the windows, Caleb came in carrying a small carved box. He set it on the table between them. "Been meaning to give you this," he said, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Inside lay a simple silver band, engraved with a single word, "Freedom." She looked up at him, tears brimming. "I don't want a bride sent by anyone," he said softly. I want a wife who chooses this life. And me. Nora's heart swelled until it felt too big for her chest. She reached across the table, her hand trembling but sure. Then this is my choice. He slid the ring onto her finger, and the moment felt both sacred and simple, like something that had always been meant to happen. Outside, the wind swept gently across the valley, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and new beginnings. Nora stepped out onto the porch later, the ring catching the afternoon light. The land stretched before her, vast and full of promise. Once she had arrived expecting chains. Now she walked in freedom, beside a man who had never sought to own her, only to love her. And for the rest of her days, that kindness remained the foundation of everything they built. Together.